Under the fading light of a late autumn afternoon, I remained curled up on the worn-out sofa, my legs tucked beneath me, arms wrapped tightly around my chest as if I could hold all the broken pieces of myself together. The left side of my face throbbed, bruised and tender, a dark crescent under my eye standing as silent testimony to the violence that had unfolded. But the real wound was deeper. When my parents walked in through the front door, there was no gasp, no rush to cradle me in their arms, no fury, just silence. Their eyes, both of them, flickered to the bruise, lingered there for a single heartbeat, and then turned away. It wasn't shock that crossed my father's face, it was something more analytical, like he was solving an equation, measuring the risk of confrontation versus the convenience of denial. My mother, ever graceful even in discomfort, trembled just slightly, the plastic grocery bag in her hand rustling as if echoing her hesitation. The smell of laundry detergent and dish soap clung to their clothes, ordinary scents that suddenly felt alien, misplaced in this fractured space. Before I could gather the strength to stand, the hallway behind me came alive with sound. The scuff of bare feet, the clink of a bottle, and then, like a shadow moving through a scene already spoiled, Colton emerged, shirtless, holding a half-drunk beer in one hand, his body slouched, but his confidence unmistakable. He leaned casually against the doorframe and offered a smirk soaked in cruelty. "Well, would you look at that? The polite little family's back," he drawled, as if he'd rehearsed it, as if mocking me was part of his daily routine. He didn't bother hiding the satisfaction in his tone. He knew no one would challenge him. My father responded with a tight nod, a corporate gesture, like approving a bad investment he had no choice but to keep. My mother couldn't meet my eyes. She turned away, stepped into the kitchen, and began unloading groceries with an eerie kind of precision. It was almost theatrical, like she was setting up a scene where nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. They didn't ask me if I was okay. They didn't look back. Um, they just left. Footsteps soft, the door closing behind them without force. No slam, no apology, just a quiet click, like the exhale of someone too tired to fight anymore. The quiet that followed was suffocating. I could hear every tick of the wall clock, each one louder than the last, filling the room like static. Colton dropped into the recliner with a grunt, the cushions sighing under his weight. He belched unapologetically, stretched out like a man claiming his throne. I didn't need to look at him to know the image. His stomach rising and falling slowly, his eyelids drooping, the beer bottle resting against his chest with the balance of long-practiced habit. My fingers reached up and brushed the bruise again, but this time I didn't wince. This time I touched it with intention, to remember, to burn the moment into my mind. Because the truth was, this didn't start today. Pain like this doesn't begin in a single instant. It creeps, like mold, growing in the shadows. Earlier that day, maybe 2 hours before the bruise bloomed on my cheek, I had finally said something. The words had spilled out before I could stop them. "Stop treating me like I'm something you got at a discount bin. I'm not cheap." I stood in the kitchen doorway, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Colton was mid-sip, beer halfway to his lips. He looked up, not surprised, not angry, just annoyed. "You done?" he asked, his voice flat as if I had interrupted a commercial. And then, before I could answer, the back of his hand found my face. The slap cracked through the room, sharp and sudden. My head snapped to the side, my body knocked against the edge of the counter. My ribs flared in pain, and my breath fled me like a coward. He didn't yell. He didn't rage. He simply stepped forward and offered the same hand, now gentle. "Babe, come on. You always push. You always gotta make it a thing." I stood there, too stunned to speak, too tired to argue. Maybe I nodded. I can't remember, but I know I didn't say no. Well, sorry. Later, after he'd slumped into the recliner and drifted into the kind of nap that only the entitled can afford, I walked to the bathroom. I saw the blood at the corner of my lip and dabbed it away with toilet paper. I watched the red spread like a slow bloom. I looked in the mirror, and what I saw wasn't defeat. It was a quiet fury. I said aloud to no one, "I don't matter to them." Not to him, but I exist. My voice, though soft, didn't shake. I went to my phone, opened a conversation labeled only with a single letter, R. I typed, "I'm ready." My thumb hovered, hesitated, deleted it. Then I typed it again and hit send. No explanation, no plea. I didn't check for a reply. I didn't need one. Outside, night began to swallow the sky. A chill pressed through the seams of the window, making the curtains stir like lungs drawing shallow breaths. 30 minutes passed. Not the kind of minutes you forget, but the kind that stretch and pulse with meaning. And then the lock turned. Colton grunted, stirred, didn't rise. I stood and opened the door. Rachel was there, no makeup, no coat, just a thick knit sweater and jeans. In one hand, a plain black duffel, under the other arm, a brown folder. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, they saw everything. She stepped inside silently. She looked at me, at the bruise, then at Colton. I gave the smallest nod. She set the bag and folder down with care, as if she were placing a key piece of evidence at a crime scene. I walked barefoot to the kitchen, the floor cool and creaking beneath me. From the drawer, I took out a black envelope, the kind reserved for quiet departures. I walked back to the living room and laid it gently beside Colton's beer. He squinted at it, confused. "What the hell is that?" he mumbled, his words slurred. I met his gaze, truly met it, and for once I didn't flinch. "Oh, don't worry," I said. "It's not poison." I let that hang in the air before adding, "But it might kill something else." He blinked slowly, swiped lazily at the envelope and missed. I turned away and walked down the hall. One step, then another, each one lighter than the last. The carpet beneath my feet muffled each step, absorbing sound like it had done for years, bearing witness to countless silent nights. Rachel trailed just behind me, quiet as breath, the duffel bag now slung confidently over her shoulder like she was prepared for war. When we entered the bedroom, I didn't let the door slam. I didn't even let it click shut. Instead, I eased it closed as though I were laying a child down to sleep, gentle, final, reverent. That quiet act was the punctuation to a sentence I'd been building for years. Rachel was already moving before I turned around. She unzipped the duffel with practiced ease. The room smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner, but beneath that crispness was something old and heavy. Fear. Not mine. His. Colton hadn't set foot in this room in weeks, yet the remnants of his presence still clung to the air, the shadows, the walls. It was the kind of fear that lingered long after the threat had left the room, that settled deep into the fabric of the furniture and refused to leave. She placed a slim, worn folder on the bed beside a neatly rolled change of clothes, a still-wrapped toothbrush, and a black leather-bound notebook edged with colored tabs like bookmarks in a story I hadn't wanted to read. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror above the dresser. The bruise beneath my eye had started to descend, seeping into the curve of my cheekbone like ink on paper. I raised 2 fingers to it, pressing just enough to feel the ache, not to soothe, to remember, to mark it. Proof that it had happened, proof that he'd done it, and that they'd seen it and still turned away. Rachel pulled a small silver recorder from her pocket, no larger than a lipstick. "Fresh batteries," she murmured, her voice barely louder than the tension in the room. Then she handed me the folder. I sat at the edge of the bed, legs tight together, spine straight, and opened it with care. Every sheet, every word, every image was a mirror reflecting what I had lived through in silence. A notarized power of attorney granting me sole control of our shared accounts, screenshots of transactions, Colton siphoning off funds for gambling apps, for online poker, for things I didn't even know he liked. Digital proof of his recklessness, his theft, and his disregard. There were incident reports, dated and time-stamped, that I had written in fits of courage, only to hide away again in terror. One from January, one from June, another from just last week. All of them now bore Rachel's red markings, circles, underlines, notes in the margins. Her pen was her sword, and at the very back, like a hidden treasure, was a lease. A tiny apartment, 12 miles south, tucked behind a laundromat, modest and clean. It was under Rachel's name, but my signature was there. I paid the first 2 months, she said, as if reading my doubt. You don't owe me. I need you to know that. I didn't say anything. I didn't cry. I simply flipped to the final page, held my gaze on the date and signature, then closed the folder with both hands and placed it back down on the bed. Carefully, deliberately, like setting down a heavy stone I no longer needed to carry. 2 weeks earlier, we'd sat in a public library under buzzing lights, pretending to flip through cookbooks. She whispered then, "You don't need this to believe yourself, but the court does. His lawyer will want evidence." When I asked why she was helping me, why she would risk this, she didn't hesitate. Because no one else is. Because I believe you. Because I won't let them call this a marriage while it rots you from the inside. That night I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the lines of the plaster with my eyes, and for the first time in years, I let myself believe something simple. I mattered, not to everyone, but to someone. Rachel tapped her phone, breaking the moment. "We've got one window," she said. "After that, he'll know. He'll watch every door, every step, every sound." I nodded, calm. "He's already lost control," I said. "He just hasn't realized it yet." She reached into the duffel and retrieved a flip phone. No apps, no GPS, no distractions. Just buttons, just numbers. "If he finds this," she said, handing it to me with a look that was more warning than fear, "he'll tear this house apart." The plastic was cold in my palm. Somehow, it made everything real. "Then we'd better move," I murmured, before the couch stopped snoring. It was half a joke, but the timing was perfect. As if summoned, we heard it. The low groan of wood, the shuffle of heavy feet, the clink of glass. He was awake. I crossed the room and cracked the door just enough to listen. The front room was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. The silence now felt thick, like something waiting to snap. I knew the envelope was open by now. I could picture his eyes scanning the documents, his mouth moving silently as he processed the numbers, the dates, the sticky note I had left at the bottom. "You'll want a lawyer, not a beer." Rachel looked at me, then at the hall. "Time," she whispered. But we didn't make it to the door. Heavy footsteps pounded toward the bedroom. I didn't wait. I flung the door open just as his hand rose to knock. Colton froze, one arm raised mid-swing. His eyes widened, his pupils contracted sharply. His mouth opened like he was about to yell, but no sound came. I held up my phone. "That envelope," I said quietly. "It's the beginning, not the end." He blinked once, confused, then furious. His hand shot forward and grabbed my wrist. Not violently, just firm, dominant, as if he thought that was enough to take back everything. But his panic betrayed him. I saw it. For the first time, he was the one who looked small. Rachel stepped up behind me. Her phone was raised. "Let go of her," she said, in a tone so flat, so final, it didn't need repeating. "This is already live." Colton's hand released instantly, like he'd touched a hot stove. He stepped back, confused, breath shallow. His eyes darted between us, searching for ground that no longer existed beneath him. I took one step forward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tremble. "Smile, Colton," I said. "You're finally on camera." He stood frozen. That silence, It was louder than his insults, louder than his violence. His jaw twitched, his brow furrowed, but he said nothing. Then came the explosion. "You set me up," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You dragged your friend into our marriage." He paced in circles, rage mixing with disbelief. "You're trying to ruin me." Rachel didn't move. Her phone didn't waver. I didn't flinch. "You ruined yourself," I said. He circled again like a lion trapped in its own cage. "This is entrapment," he barked. "You can't just record someone and—" But we could, and we had. Under the low light of a quiet hallway, my steps were swallowed by the carpet. Rachel moved just behind me, the duffel bag balanced on her shoulder with a quiet determination. We entered the bedroom, and I let the door drift closed. No slam, no abrupt click, just a soft closure, like I was tucking something fragile into place. Inside, Rachel silently unpacked, the zipper sliding. A faint scent of lemon cleaner mingled with something colder. Leftover fear. Not mine. His. Even though Colton hadn't entered this room in weeks, his presence clung to the walls like lingering shadows. Rachel placed a slim folder on the bed beside neatly rolled fresh clothes, a toothbrush still in its wrapper, and a sturdy black notebook whose tabs peeked out like bookmarks marking unspoken truths. Glancing into the mirror, I saw swelling melting from my eye into a sullen bruise on my cheekbone. I pressed 2 fingers against it, not to soothe, but to affirm, he did this. My parents saw. They ignored me. Rachel removed a recorder, sleek as lipstick. "Fresh batteries," she whispered, then handed it, and the folder, to me. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Inside was everything I'd held inside. Notarized power of attorney giving me control of shared accounts, screenshots of Colton siphoning money into poker gambling apps, incident reports I'd drafted in whispers, one from January, one from June, one just the week before, each stamped with Rachel's red pen. At the back, a lease, an apartment 12 miles south, under her name, signed by me. "I covered the first 2 months," Rachel said quietly. "You don't know me. I need you to know that." I didn't respond or cry. I flipped to the last page, traced the signature, closed the folder gently, and left it on the bed like a cornerstone set in place. 2 weeks earlier, in a library lit by fluorescent bulbs, we pretended to browse cookbooks while she told me, "You don't need this to believe yourself, but the court does. His lawyer will want proof." I asked why she'd risk everything for me. She said, "Because no one else will. Because I believe you. Because I won't let you rot quietly in a marriage that's destroying you." That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and let one truth settle in. I matter to someone. Rachel tapped her phone softly. "We have one window. Afterwards, he'll monitor every exit, every text, every noise." I nodded. "He's lost control. He just doesn't know it yet." From the duffel, she retrieved a flip phone. No apps, no tracking. "If he finds this," she warned, "he'll tear this house apart." Its plastic was cold in my hand. "Simple, basic, powerful," I said, half laughing. "Then we'd better move before the couch stops snoring." Almost on cue, I heard it. The wooden floor creak, footsteps. The recliner gave him away. He was moving toward us. I cracked the bedroom door. Silence filled the front room, weighted and expectant. He'd probably open the envelope. I imagined him scanning the documents, red circles, labels, dates, and his face when he read my sticky note. "You'll want a lawyer, not a beer." Rachel whispered, "Now." Before Colton could knock, I stepped into the hall. He froze, mid-mash erased, his eyes wide, pupils sharp, mouth agape but silent. I held up my phone. "That envelope's just the beginning, not the end." He blinked, stunned, anger replaced confusion. He lunged and grabbed my wrists. Firm, not violent, a symbolic show of control. But there was panic in his grip. His guilt was as clear as my resolve. Rachel stepped forward, phone raised. Let go of her, she stated calmly. This is live. His hand snapped away as if from a burn. He staggered, searching for power that wasn't there. I moved forward, shoulders squared. Smile, Colton. You're finally on camera. He didn't blink. He stood, mute. The silence pressed harder than any slap. His jaw twitched in defeat. Then he roared, You set me up. You brought your friend into our marriage to bait me. Rage mixed with desperation, his chest heaving. You're trying to destroy me. But I stood firm. Rachel held steady. He paced with frantic energy. This is entrapment. You can't just record someone and I spoke calmly. I didn't bring a witness. I brought protection. His staggered, bewildered. He jabbed at the kitchen, accusation quivering. I swear to God, my, I'll call the cops. I'll say you're unstable, that you broke into my email. I tilted my head, unafraid. Good. He flinched. I walked slowly to the coffee table and picked up the manila envelope I had placed earlier. I already called them, I said softly. You'll want to be ready when they knock. He opened it slowly and froze. Inside were stapled documents, medical notes, dated incident records, photographs, and a printed copy of my restraining order request titled Emergency Petition Domestic Safety Concern. Silence followed. It was not relief. It was the crushing weight of truth against a man who believed he could always walk away. His hand went slack. I stepped back, creating space while memory washed over me. 2 months ago, I began documenting everything, not to build a case, but because I was tired of doubting myself. Bruises I couldn't explain. Bathroom locks rattled while he pounded the door. I snapped pictures, sent them to Rachel, and she typed back, Keep documenting, I believe you. 4 words stronger than any blow he dealt. I got a nurse friend to notarize me our note. Why I didn't tell the truth at the time, I'm not sure. And then came the voice recording, his slurred voicemail last week when he said, No one believes you. I'm the one with a job. You're nothing but a burden. Now in the living room, he tried again. People will think you're obsessive. You'll seem unstable. You're paranoid. I pressed play on the recording app. His voice filled the room. Velvet fury. You think you matter? You're just my property. Nothing but a burden. He flinched. Rachel stared. He shrank. The red and blue flash of police lights flickered through the blinds. Colton spun. You actually called them? I didn't speak. I walked calmly to the front door, placed a hand on the knob, inhaled, and then said almost kindly, Let's see if you still smirk in a mugshot. He panicked, shouting, She's setting me up. She's unstable. She's got a friend with a camera. By the time 2 officers appeared with flashlights piercing the hallway, Colton had already raised his hands in surrender. He blurted rehearsed lines. She ambushed me. She's unstable. She's ruining my life. I motioned to the kitchen table where the folders lay, tabbed, dated, signed. Rachel handed one officer a USB drive. I said, You'll want to start with the timeline. The younger officer opened the USB. The older one looked at Rachel and then me. You did all this? She asked, surprised. I nodded. Yes, ma'am. He whistled low at the timestamps. These are timestamped and notarized? He asked. Yes, I replied evenly. Colton, half hidden in the stairwell's shadows, scoffed. This is insane. You're staging an entire production. But the officers ignored him, paging through the files. They asked him to take a seat, but he lingered. One officer clicked on his radio. Colton's shoulders sagged. He sat. Night gave way to dawn. By sunrise, we were in separate cruisers headed to the station. I sat beside Officer Brenly, her patrol car seat cold against my jeans. At the precinct, Rachel and I were separated. She gave me a look of solidarity before being led away. I was ushered into a pale green interview room, windowless with only a table, two chairs, and a steady surveillance camera humming overhead. In the dim, muted light of the interview room, I sat in silence, hands resting on my lap, trying to quiet the lingering storm in my chest. The walls were painted a soft green, the kind that was meant to be calming, but only made everything feel more clinical, more distant. A low hum from the ceiling light filled the silence until Officer Brenly returned. She stepped back inside alone, closing the door behind her with an intentional gentleness. Not the kind of door close that announces something. No, it was the kind, you know, she began, settling into the chair across from me while pulling out a small, worn notebook. It's not often someone walks in with this level of documentation. I didn't return the sentiment. I didn't come here ready to fight, I said, my voice level and steady. I came ready to be heard. She paused, her eyes searching mine, not unkind, but assessing, like she was trying to see if what I said matched who I was. We turned our attention to the documents. She flipped through them one by one, and with each page, she asked questions, clear, pointed, procedural. I answered all of them calmly, factually, without a tremble in my voice. I had already shed every tear I had to give inside that house. This place wasn't going to see me fall apart. From across the hallway, the muffled echo of Colton's voice broke through. It was unmistakably his, raised, cutting, defensive. There was no mistaking that rhythm, that volume, that tone that had once made me flinch. Officer Brenly stood briefly and stepped out. Through the small window, I watched as a man in a tailored gray suit entered the opposite room. I didn't need to ask who he was. His arrival was too fast, too timed. That was Colton's lawyer, probably sent by his father, retired judge, well known in. When Brenly returned, something subtle had shifted in her posture. Her questions became less about the facts and more about the motives behind them, less about what happened and more about why it took this long for me to come forward. She tapped her pen against a document on the table. The affidavit. So, she said slowly, you waited until today to contact the authorities. Why now? My reply came without pause. I reached into the folder and pulled out one last document, one I had kept tucked away like a final card. I didn't wait, I said, sliding the sheet across to her. I warned someone. Months ago. She looked down at it, reading the header. A signed statement from my therapist dated half a year ago. The contents were clear and direct. Concern for my safety, references to repeated emotional distress, and the escalating nature of Colton's behavior. She had specifically named him. The final paragraph stated plainly, client displays ongoing fear for her personal safety inside the home. If aggression continues, she should pursue legal safety measures immediately. Officer Brenly read it twice. Her eyes lingered on the therapist's signature. But she still asked the question I'd come to expect, the one I feared most. You're not just doing this as a strategy for the divorce, are you? Trying to get the upper hand over property, over custody? For a moment, my hands did shake, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of this same assumption. I folded them tightly in my lap and looked her directly in the eye. I know how I must look to you, I said, too calm, too collected, like someone who planned this. But if I'd waited until it got worse, people would say I should have spoken up sooner. And now that I've come forward prepared, they say I must be scheming. So yes, I documented because I knew no one would believe me unless I did. She didn't say anything in response, just noted something in her pad. My mind drifted to a memory. 3 months ago, in the warm, softly lit office of my therapist, outside it had been freezing, but inside, the quiet buzz of the heater made the space feel almost safe. I'd looked at her and whispered, if I leave and no one helps me, and he ends up killing me anyway, what will they say then? That I was crazy for staying? She'd paused, then met my eyes and said something I'd never forgotten. Then leave in a way they won't be able to ignore. That night, I didn't draw up a revenge plan. I drew up a survival strategy. Back in the station, Officer Brenly stood again. "I'll be back in a moment," she said before exiting. I sat and watched the second hand of the clock crawl its way around the dial, counting the seconds of my new life. When she returned, the look on her face told me she didn't want to say what came next. "We're holding him for 24 hours, she said. "After that, well, it becomes more complicated." I nodded once. No outbursts, no surprise. She handed me a clipboard with official paperwork, restraining order documents. I signed them, one after another. No ceremony. Just a task that needed finishing. Outside, morning had arrived in pale, exhausted colors. The air bit into my skin as I stepped outside, but I didn't pull my jacket tighter. Rachel was waiting at the bottom of the concrete steps, leading away from the building. She didn't say anything, just looked at me. "Did they listen?" she asked. I nodded and we turned together toward the parking lot. "That," I whispered to myself as I slid into the front seat, "was the easy part, because what came next would hurt more than any police statement, more than any cross-examination. It was calling my mother." But the car ride back was thick with silence, not the kind you fill with music or conversation, the kind that simply exists. Rachel drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes forward. The apartment came into view, a modest rental unit I'd found in a rush. Bland, small, temporary. A space for breathing, not for building a life. We stepped inside, carrying the last of my things. Rachel didn't speak. She'd been beside me since the beginning of this day, through the police forms, the interviews, the bureaucracy. And now she was standing in a stranger's living room with furniture neither of us picked. She unfolded a blanket over the couch and looked at me. "You want me to stay?" she asked. I shook my head. I need to do this part alone. She seemed to understand. Maybe she'd done something similar once. Maybe she knew this was about reclaiming something, not just safety, but voice. When she left, the stillness in the apartment was almost holy. My hands didn't know where to rest. They trembled slightly, as though still holding the memory of what I'd walked through. I sat at the small plastic kitchen table, edges chipped, laminate peeling, and pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over her name. Not mother, not home, just mom. Always had been. I tapped. It rang. I didn't flinch like I had as a child. I didn't brace like I had when Colton shouted. My heart didn't race. It just ached. She answered. "Miss." Her voice was flat, neither warm nor alarmed, just neutral. "I wanted to let you know," I said slowly. "He's been arrested." Silence. "For what?" I swallowed. "For what he did to me." She didn't speak, and I kept going. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I needed to say the words aloud, not for validation, not even for comfort, but to hear myself speak them to someone who had known me before I understood what fear really meant, before bruises became routine, before ER visits blended into background noise, before money went missing like breath under shouting. I had thought, somehow, that maybe she'd noticed. Maybe she had seen something, anything. Maybe she would come back if only I gave her the truth. A pause stretched between us, long and cold. And then she finally said it. "Marriage isn't perfect, miss. But broadcasting your personal mess like this, we raised you stronger than that." My fingers curled around the chipped edge of the kitchen table. That was it. That was her answer. No softness. No disbelief. No anger on my behalf. Just disappointment that I'd told someone. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even fully feel the sting until several seconds later when the realization landed with quiet devastation. I had been clinging to the wrong kind of hope all along, the kind that says if you just say it right, maybe they'll come back to you. I set the phone down without ending the call. Her voice kept droning for a few seconds more, then faded into static silence and disappeared completely. I stared at it, then pushed it aside and pulled open the journal Rachel had given me months ago. The one with soft pages and a dark blue cover. The one she handed me back when she first started noticing the silence in my eyes. I picked up a pen and wrote slowly, deliberately, carving each letter like it mattered. Today I buried the last illusion. I don't need her to understand. I just need to stop needing her. I closed the journal and set it beside me. My eyes wandered across the room. In the purse I'd carried to the precinct earlier, the edge of the envelope peeked out. That thick, heavy envelope full of printed screenshots, medical records, signed statements, the one I had prepared but never thought I'd actually have to use. I retrieved a clean folder from the drawer, slid the envelope inside with care, and wrote a single word across it in black marker. Closure. Outside, the sunlight had slipped low in the sky. Shadows stretched long and thin across the carpet, creating a quiet that felt more internal than external. I walked to the kettle, filled it, and made tea, not because I wanted to drink it, but because I needed something warm to hold, something grounding. The mug felt sturdy in my hands as I sank into the couch. The steam rose slowly. I watched it curl in the still air, watched it fade like everything else. My body remembered every bruise, every impact, every moment of recoiling. But I didn't flinch anymore. That's when the knock came. Two sharp taps, not violent, not urgent, just precise. I rose and opened the door. Rachel stood on the other side. Her face was pale, but not from fear, from something else entirely. You need to see this, she said, brushing past me without waiting. She reached for the remote on the coffee table, turned on the small television mounted above the kitchen counter, and flipped to a local news station. There he was, Colton. Standing tall in a crisp button-down shirt, not a wrinkle in sight, his expression composed, carefully rehearsed. His lawyer hovered off to the side, nodding in rhythm with the lies about to come. I never meant to hurt anyone, Colton said smoothly into the microphone. My wife is going through some emotional struggles. It's been a very difficult time. All I want is for her to get the help she needs. Rachel's head turned toward me. Help, she hissed. I didn't react. I didn't blink. I just watched. Colton smiled for the cameras, practiced and polished, and something inside me, something that had been trembling since day one, went completely still. Turned, walked back to the table, and opened my laptop. Rachel tilted her head. What are you doing? I didn't answer. I clicked into a blank document and began to type. Not to the police, not to a lawyer or judge, but to someone who could truly make this matter. Someone with reach, someone who couldn't ignore what they were about to read. I typed and read through the letter once, just once. Then I hit send. Because that night, I didn't cry. I didn't break. I wrote. And I sent that letter to someone who could make it echo louder than Colton ever imagined. The night dragged on. By the time the harsh orange of the street lamps faded into the early, tired gray of morning, I was still at the kitchen counter. The apartment around me was still, except for the occasional groan from the refrigerator. Sleep never came, but I didn't need it. My body didn't ask for rest. It had asked for truth, and I had delivered. I sat there, hunched over the screen of my laptop, the blue light fading to a low dim. A chipped mug sat in front of me, the last sip of coffee long gone cold. My hands didn't tremble, not from fear, not anymore. The email was still open on the screen, addressed to Elisa Carrington, a journalist I had never spoken to, but had been quietly watching for weeks. Her name had appeared on my screen one sleepless night when I stumbled on a report she'd done about a woman who exposed her husband, a state senator, and survived not just the scandal, but the shame. That story changed state law. That night, I bookmarked her name. Tonight, I used it. I wrote under it, "Dear Elisa, I don't know if you'll believe me, but I'm going to give you every reason to." I attached everything: the bank statements, the money transfers made without my consent, the audio files I had saved from his drunk tirades, photos, receipts, threats hidden between casual texts, the official police report, my full timeline. Then I added one last line. I read it twice before hitting send. "If I disappear, this is my voice. Publish it anyway." I clicked send. Then I closed the laptop, leaned back in the chair, and looked out the narrow kitchen window. The sky outside was shifting from steel gray to pale peach. Down the street, someone dragged a trash bin to the curb. Life hadn't changed, but I had. I hadn't cried the night before, and I didn't now, but my breaths were slower, fuller, as though I had finally exhaled something I'd been holding for too many years. I stood, walked into the bathroom, turned on the light, and looked at myself in the mirror. The bruise beneath my eye had faded to yellow, soft and mottled, like bruised fruit. For a brief second, I reached up and I lifted my hand to my face and gently touched the fading bruise beneath my eye with the tip of my finger. My reflection stared back in the bathroom mirror, familiar yet different. "You're not my shame anymore," I whispered. The words weren't thunderous. They didn't shake the walls, but they were steady. They felt real, and real for the first time in a long time. Felt enough. My phone buzzed on the counter. I stepped out, still toweling my face, and glanced at the screen. An email. The sender, Alyssa Carrington. Subject line, "Restory submission." My heart kicked once in my chest. I opened it. "This will not be buried. I'll call you in an hour." That's when I let myself smile. Just a small one, but real. I set the coffee aside and splashed cold water on my face, rinsing away not just sleep or tiredness, but years of silence. Then I sat back at the laptop and waited. I didn't fidget. I didn't rehearse. I simply waited, breath steady. 45 minutes passed like a quiet march, and then the Zoom link arrived. I clipped. Elisa's face appeared, framed by soft, natural light, sharp eyes alert despite the signs of exhaustion. No makeup, no pretense. She looked like someone who hadn't slept, but didn't need to. She looked like someone who didn't waste time on anything except truth. "Miss," she said, her voice firm but not cold. "Thank you for trusting me." "I wasn't sure I should," I answered honestly. "Good," she nodded. "You shouldn't trust easily, but you trusted smart." Then came the process. Line by line, document by document, she verified everything: screenshots, audio files, statements, timestamps, my voice messages. Nothing rushed, no false reassurances. She didn't pity me. She respected me. It felt less like an interview and more like passing a baton in a relay. I had carried it this far. Now she was ready to run. But what she said next cracked something deeper than anything else. "You're not the only one." I blinked. "What do you mean?" "There's another woman. Different state, same man, different name, but same pattern. I've verified her story too. Would you like to be connected?" My stomach flipped. A quiet nausea crept up my spine. Oh, Colton. He had done this before, somewhere. Another woman had once sat in a room just like this. Had spoken the same words into the void, had begged to be believed, and had likely been dismissed. "Yes," I said, my voice low but resolute. "Please." We ended the call. Elisa promised to publish by Monday. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the screen fall with a soft final click. I sat still, absorbing the moment. Then, just as I reached to stand up, the burner phone, the emergency line Rachel had given me, buzzed loudly against the countertop. A text lit up the screen from unknown number. You've made a mistake. Fix it or I will. I read it once, and then again, I didn't flinch. I didn't even move. Out loud to the empty kitchen, I said, no, I just finally corrected one. I left the phone where it was. I refused to hold fear in my hand anymore because this time I wasn't alone. By Sunday, I wasn't hiding, I was preparing, and I wasn't the only one building a storm. I zipped up my jacket against the cool breeze that blew through the late morning. I made my way to the side entrance of the old community center on Mason Street, the same one that hosted AA meetings at night and smelled permanently of burnt coffee and chalk dust. Its hallway was lined with flyers, workshops on self-defense, grief counseling, immigration legal aid. My fingers brushed each paper as I passed, the staples rusting slightly at the corners. I found the room Alyssa had booked. The folding chair creaked under me as I sat down. Across the table sat two women, Dana and Alana, both slightly older than me, both with eyes that told stories their mouths hadn't shared yet. They looked up. We didn't greet each other as survivors, we greeted each other as strategists. That was Elisa's doing too. She had called each of us individually on Friday. "We are others," she said, "and it's time you met." Dana spoke first, voice crisp but tired. "We're not here to swap war stories, right?" "No," I said, clear. "We're here to change the pattern." She nodded and placed a thick folder on the table. Its corners were frayed. "Financial manipulation," she said. "He forged my signature, rerouted business accounts, left me with the IRS at my throat." Alana added quietly, "He isolated me. I had no credit in my name. When I pressed charges, the police said I didn't look scared enough. First time. Second time, the DA dropped it. Said it might destabilize the family unit." I leaned forward. "What we have now isn't just stories anymore, it's receipts." Alana slid over a thumb drive. Dana unfolded printed spreadsheets. I opened my laptop and logged into the encrypted shared drive Elisa had set up for us under a decoy name. One by one, we uploaded it all. Hospital records, photos, screenshots, voicemails. Every time the system had looked away, we had saved the moment anyway. That afternoon, we launched something small, but powerful. A website, just one page. 3 names, 3 testimonies, 1 headline. "We are not asking for justice. We are showing you the proof you refuse to see." My final upload was a voice recording, Colton's voice. "You can scream," he said, his tone mocking, "but no one's listening." I typed a caption beneath the file. We heard each other. That was it. No hashtags, no flair, just truth. By 4 p.m., I was driving back to my apartment. The wind had picked up, leaves spinning in tight spirals, the kind of weather that feels like something's shifting. I stopped at the market and bought pasta and frozen lemon bars. I never liked them much, but they were my mother's favorite. Maybe I needed the memory of someone who once cared. Or maybe I was preparing for a kind of closure you don't get from a courtroom. Back home, I plugged in my phone and opened Elisa's news outlet. In her draft folder, a headline glowed. "The hands behind the silence, 3 women, 1 man, and the system that let him roam." I stared at it for a long time. My hand pressed flat against the table. The other rose gently to the bruise under my eye, now barely a shadow. "You're not the shame anymore," I whispered again. This time, I meant it all the way through. I made the mistake of opening Instagram. It wasn't intentional, just muscle memory. And there it was, a photo of Colton and me on our wedding day. I was wrapped in white lace, a bouquet clutched in both hands, and he stood beside me in his crisp navy suit, all smiles and promise. He'd captioned it, "No one knew her like I did." I didn't flinch, not even a flicker in my chest. He was baiting me, playing the crowd, feeding the narrative to people who still saw him through polished smiles and firm handshakes. Family, coworkers, even women from church who still called him such a gentleman. He wanted noise, he wanted reaction, but I gave him what he couldn't manipulate: silence. And then something. I pulled up the folder I'd hidden for years, a private cloud archive under a decoy name. Inside was a photo I'd never shared, one I hadn't even looked at in ages. A close-up of a hospital wristband, stark against pale skin. The timestamp was unmistakable, exactly 1 year before our wedding. That night, Colton had driven me to the ER himself, his arm tight around my shoulders, his voice calm as he told the intake nurse I'd tripped down the stairs. I remember the cold of the floor tiles against my back more clearly than I remember the fall. I posted that photo, no caption, no explanation, just the date, just the truth. It didn't need adornment. The facts were ugly enough to speak for themselves. Then, just as quickly, I logged out. Around 7:30, the wind began to pick up outside. The windows rattled softly as I stood by the stove. I stirred pasta in a pot, steam curling into the air, the scent of garlic and starch hanging heavy in the kitchen. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't brave either. What I felt was something deeper, more rooted, like what happens when you straighten your spine after hunching for too long. Your body hurts, but it also remembers how it's supposed to stand. I ate a little, enough to feel grounded. Then, before heading to bed, I walked the small apartment, checking the locks, not out of fear, but habit. I paused by the window, staring out into the darkness that clung to the street. Tomorrow would change everything. The article Elisa had written was going live in the morning. There would be no more whispers among women, no more hiding behind private messages or shadowed timelines. It would be public, and the world would have to decide what to do with our truth. Just before midnight, I lit a candle. It was one I hadn't used since I moved in, a pale blue votive with a scent I couldn't name but remembered. My therapist had once told me rituals matter when you're reclaiming space, even if it's just symbolic. I sat in the living room, letting the flame flicker in the quiet. I didn't pray. Not to anyone. I just whispered to myself, voice steady. The article went live at exactly 7:02 IMM. I didn't have to scroll. Elisa's piece was pinned to the top of every newsfeed and shared across social media before my tea had finished steeping. By 9:00 IMM, I got the first call. Colton's lawyer. He sounded winded, clipped, unsure how to measure his words. I didn't answer. At 9:15, a new alert flashed on my phone. This time, it was from Colton's firm. Termination review initiated. Confidentiality lifted. A public statement will follow within the hour. They weren't mincing words. The tide had turned. I stood in my kitchen, barefoot, my tea cooling on the counter, unread emails piling behind that notification. But I didn't post. I didn't text Rachel. I didn't forward anything. I simply exhaled. It was the quietest sound I'd made all morning, but it weighed more than anything else. I spent the rest of the day in pieces of normalcy, folding laundry, feeding the cat, wiping dust off the windowsill with a rag. Every so often, I glanced at my phone, not obsessively, just enough to see the digital wave build. Comments, shares, reposts, testimonies from strangers who now saw a little bit of their pain reflected in ours. Some praised Elisa, others simply said, "Me too." And then came the private messages, the ones that didn't flood in but arrived like drops against glass. One of them was from a woman named Camille. I read the article she wrote. I was one of his patients. Thank you for not staying quiet. I sat down at the kitchen table, not because I was weak, but because my legs gave out in a new kind of release. Not fear, not shock, just a letting go. The kind of tremble that comes when the weight you didn't realize you'd been holding finally eases off your shoulders. By noon, another number appeared, a law office. I hesitated, but answered. Bonne marché. The voice was a woman, calm and clear. This is Turin Everett from the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. I'm calling to inform you we're reopening your case. For a moment, my brain flatlined. I couldn't register what she'd said. It was like trying to read a foreign language written in your own handwriting. I'm sorry it took this long, she continued, voice gentler now. There were procedural barriers. But now that the audio evidence has gone public, particularly the clips you shared with Miss Carrington, those barriers no longer apply. I could have said 100 things, demanded answers, screamed that it shouldn't have taken an article and 1,000 shares to be believed. But I didn't. I just said, thank you for catching up. She understood what I meant. We scheduled a formal statement for Thursday. After the call, I wandered into the bedroom. The closet door stood half open, just like it had all those months ago when I'd hidden inside with my phone, whispering into the dark. I'm recording this just in case. That audio was now at the bottom of Elise's article and, according to Taryn, officially on record in the county courthouse. My phone buzzed again. I walked to the kitchen and checked the screen, half expecting another stranger's support. But it wasn't. It was Colton. He'd uploaded a video, no music, no filter, just him, messy hair, red eyes, trembling voice. And making me look like a monster, he said. She's twisting everything. I loved her. I still do. But this is cruel. She's not the woman you think she is. She's angry. She's vengeful. I watched him speak. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel sorry. I felt awake. I saw the performance clearly now, the cracks, the false humility, the trembling voice designed to sway. And then buried in the replies, one comment began to rise above the rest. It wasn't loud, it wasn't poetic, but it was the truth. She didn't break the silence, it said. She survived it. That's louder. The video had been shared more than 30,000 times before the hour was even up. A firestorm unleashed in the palm of my hand, and yet all I did was close the tab and gently set my phone face down on the table. My cat stirred slightly in his sun-drenched spot on the floor, but didn't bother to lift his head. The sky outside had taken on that soft golden hue that only visits in the late afternoon, and I watched a narrow beam of sunlight stretch across the kitchen tile. My tea was long cold, and then came the next alert, this one legal, clinical in tone but loud in meaning. Protective order expanded. Defendant is required to surrender all registered firearms by 10 p.m. tonight. I read it once, then again, slower. The timestamp matched the court motion. He'd been served. The law, the system, the silence, they were moving, and this time in my direction. I leaned back, my fingers tracing the rim of my mug without realizing it. There was no one around to hear me, and maybe that's why I spoke aloud anyway. Quiet, low, more to the light filtering through the blinds than to anything else. We're not done, I said, but now we're not invisible either. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like shouting or dancing or posting a cryptic quote online. I just felt still, truth, when it finally has room to breathe, doesn't need to scream. That night, I lit another candle, but this one wasn't for mourning or grief or memory. It was for something I had almost forgotten I deserved. Peace. No metaphors, no grand statements, just peace. The kind you can hold in your chest and not be afraid it will shatter. 1 week later, with the sun dropping behind a gray skyline and the city cloaked in the hum of end-of-day chaos, I stood once again outside the courthouse. The same wide steps, the same echoing corridors behind those tall, impersonal doors. But my knees didn't shake this time. In my hands, I held a sealed manila folder. Plain, light in weight, but so heavy in meaning it might as well have been marble. The final paperwork, the last piece, my formal request to finalize the divorce, to uphold the protective order indefinitely, to name the trauma, close the case, and release myself from its grip. But that wasn't the real reason I had come tonight. I wasn't here to file, I was here to witness. A cool breeze tugged at my coat as I waited, my gaze tracking the blur of headlights and pedestrians across the street, the occasional honk, snippets of laughter from a nearby cafe, the murmur of evening settling into the city. All of it passed around me like I was standing inside a still frame. The courthouse behind me had already dimmed. Only one clerk remained, locking the side door with a familiar clank. Then, a set of headlights turned into the lot. A car door creaked open. Rachel stepped out first. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just looked at me, steady, like we were already deep in conversation. Dana followed her, sleeves of her coat pushed up, folder in hand, eyes tired but certain. And then Alana, the last to emerge, carrying nothing but a small, unlit candle. They didn't need to speak. We'd said enough. Over midnight phone calls and whispered hallway promises. We were done performing grief. We were building something else now. I came here alone once, I said, almost to myself. I leave with sisters now. Rachel reached for my arm and squeezed. Dana nodded, her mouth curling into a small, tired smile. Alana gave me the candle without a word. The last rays of sunlight kissed the edge of the buildings, painting the horizon in shades of lavender and amber. We walked inside together. The corridor was cold and fluorescent. The clerk didn't look up until I reached the desk. Final filing? He asked. Yeah. He stamped the form, slid it into a tray. No fanfare, no camera crews, no Colton. Just the sound of a paper slipping into a drawer and the click of bureaucracy closing a chapter. Anything else? The clerk asked. No, I said softly. That's all. When we stepped outside again, the air had shifted. Not colder, just cleaner, lighter, as if something had been lifted, if only a little. A couple strolled past us on the sidewalk, hand in hand. A little boy chased a pigeon across the courthouse lawn, shrieking with laughter. Life was moving forward, and this time, I wasn't frozen behind glass watching it go. Dana pulled a thermos from her coat. Chamomile? She offered. I'd accepted it. Still warm, familiar. I remember the first time I called you, Alana said. You sounded small, not weak, just hidden. I said. Hiding felt safer, Rachel added, but you still picked up the phone. And there it was, the moment. Not the courtroom, not the article. That was the victory. I picked up the phone, I whispered, I documented, I waited, I chose movement over mayhem. Suddenly, it all came back in a blink. The first bruise I'd covered in concealer. My mother's eyes flicking away. Colton's voice, after the apology. You made me do that. The click of a lock, the echo of being left alone. And that one night, crouched in a closet, voice trembling into my phone. My name is Miss. I'm scared, but I'm done pretending I'm not. That clip made it into the court file, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. I looked up at the courthouse windows, wondered if someone inside, a clerk, a judge, anyone, was reading that file right now, hearing not just my voice, but a whole truth. We'll walk home, I said. You sure? Rachel asked. I nodded. I need the air. No protests, no drama, Just 3 quiet hugs and a candle pressed into my hand. Or your window, Alana whispered. In case someone out there still needs to believe it gets better. I walked the rest of the way home with the candle tucked safely in my coat. Streetlights bathed the sidewalk in gold. My steps didn't race. They didn't drag. They just moved. Free, maybe not fully, but no longer chained. At home, I didn't turn on every light like I used to. I slipped off my shoes, moved through the apartment. It was small, but it was mine. The silence didn't hide fear anymore. It offered breath. The window. I lit the candle. Its flame danced in the glass, tiny but steady, casting a soft glow just strong enough to be seen from the street. And to no one, or maybe to someone exactly like I once was, I whispered. Where bruises no one sees, silence is deeper than fists, but there is healing too, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. I stood there, watching that flame, and in its light, for the first time, I didn't see what I'd lost. I saw everything I'd reclaimed.